Deciding whether to push on or back off with painful movements is one of the most challenging things that you're going to face in your rehabilitation for whatever body part you have. It's also one of the most challenging things us as healthcare professionals have in reasoning whether we push through the pain that you're feeling that's limiting you, or we back off, okay? If you've worked with me, or if you're engaging in one of my programs online or one of my courses in university, then I would be applying a reasoning process as to how much symptoms we would be willing to tolerate with your given sport, movement, or activity. Okay, say that you have just had a surgery on a reconstructed shoulder, something I've had on both sides twice, then we would have some protection that we need to go through in those initial healing phases, whereby we're maybe not going to tolerate too much symptoms and we're going to want to rest and back off. But say you've had back pain, or you've had sciatica, or you've had rotator cuff related shoulder pain, or pain for any longer than 3 months, then we're going to need to have a reasoning process to tolerate a certain amount of discomfort or symptoms to help you get going towards your meaningful goals or activities. Because in this sense, we look at pain as an alarm system that is designed to protect us, and we need to be able to nudge it in a way that is going to desensitize it. If we're backing off and just waiting, then often that can perpetuate aches and pains. And to that regard, I want you to become familiar with a traffic light analogy, or other ways that we could provide our reasoning around pushing on or backing off. You may be familiar with a rating of 0 to 10. You may have been to see a healthcare professional and they've asked you, can you describe out of 10 how intense your pain is? 10 out of 10 is the worst pain that you can ever imagine, 0 being no pain, and then you would number your pain all the way up to 10. I don't use that scale for the simple reason as it's not really practical. I live with aches and pains often myself. I train regularly, and I don't wake up and I'm constantly rating, well, is my knee pain a 4 today? Is my knee pain a 6 today? It's not something that's that helpful when it comes to a decision-making process around pushing on or backing off. So if you are using or familiar with that, then I'm going to invite you to consider moving across to either using our emojis, which start from, yeah, really happy that I have tolerated, or I'm okay with the symptoms that I'm experiencing, right the way up to totally unhappy, I'm not accepting the symptoms. And these help us move towards a traffic light analogy, which is something that a lot of people in the field of musculoskeletal rehabilitation will use for persistent pain. And it's very simple. If you're familiar with driving or traffic lights on the road, if your symptoms are a 6 or above, red light, you're pulling up to it, you stop. Whatever your activity was that you were doing and that amount of pain or symptoms happens, we back off from that activity. We're not tolerating that at this point in time. Quick reminder that, let me just qualify that pain could be a symptom, fatigue could be your symptom, swelling could be your symptom. Any and all of those would be what I would use or encourage you to use in this process, okay? Green is nice and easy to relate with, because if your symptoms are 3 or less or minimal, then green light means we're good to go. We push on. Where most of us are going to run into some problems would be amber, because that can mean one of 2 things when you're pulling up to a light. You're going to slow down because you know it's turning red, so you back off, you stop, or the complete opposite. You might miss the red light, so you put your foot down to get through. And that's really where we're at a lot of the time with rehabilitation. And it's a judgment call when our symptoms are 4 to 7 or amber. Now, many people, including me, use an even simpler metric, which is my furthest one on this side here, which is acceptable or unacceptable. Is the knee pain that I have today after doing some walking acceptable? Am I willing to accept it? That's going to come down to an individual level, and probably how happy we are with tissue damage and pain not being one and the same is going to dictate if we are accepting more pain if we've had it for a long period of time. But that is something that I use and you could also use. So whichever one speaks to you the most here, this is an important process to help us decide whether the activity that you're doing, you tolerated it. If it is amber or green, then the answer is yes. Now, sometimes you will know that you tolerated walking or swimming or lifting the weight in the session, but the day after or the day after that, you really paid the penalty and your symptoms became unacceptable. And that would also fall into the category of, okay, whatever we did there, we didn't tolerate it. So I'm going to invite you to look at your activities of daily life and consider if you prefer to keep things fluid and not write things down. Just ask yourself the question, is the symptoms that you're experiencing acceptable or unacceptable, or how have you responded in terms of a traffic light analogy in your activities of daily living? If you are someone who trains or goes to the gym, then I fully encourage you to develop note keeping, because that can really help with establishing what you are and aren't tolerating. I'm going to give you a practical example, because if you have worked with us with regards to resistance training, we have a reasoning process for that as well, called rating of perceived exertion, which is a really useful way to prescribe intensity. But here's a real life example of me applying these to myself. I've pulled these out from my notes. Last year, I had a major shoulder flare up training hard for a deadlift competition, and that led to me being very limited with squatting, holding the barbell on my back. And this is how my notes might look. Back squat, 5 reps at RPE 6, 7, 8. You don't need to worry about that. That's the intensity that I was looking to lift. And my notes were that I did 100 kilograms for 6 reps. Then I did 140 for 5. Then I did 145 for 5. And then I did 145 for 5. And at that point there, my shoulder symptoms became amber. That session was being dictated as to whether I push on or back off, not by how hard the weight was. It was dictated by my tolerance of shoulder pain within that session. And if I'm putting amber there, I'm at that judgment call. I decided to go again, see if that's consistent. I did 150 for 5, and it was also amber there. So my call there was to back off and call it a day. Okay. The following week, this was a 6-month process to get my shoulder symptoms under control. The same session, I was doing sets of 4 this time, 100 for 5, 140 for 2, 150 for 4 now. So that weight there now is starting to cause at green to amber symptoms. So my reasoning process when I'm considering that activity there, I'm between here and here. The symptoms are starting to kick in, but for me, I'm saying that they're acceptable. I'm going to work through it. Okay, so my next set, I put 160 on there, and this time it was green, amber again. So my reasoning process is guiding me, okay, I'm happy with this to push on enough to try another set. And at that point, I hit a critical threshold where I put 170 on, and this time it wasn't actually shoulder symptoms that were limiting me. I was able to then rate the perceived exertion of how hard that set was, which means that I was not limited by symptoms here now, I was limited by strength. And that's a really critical tipping point that I want to work towards. So I use this as a guide for how much I'm going to tolerate with regards to my symptoms, and I'm looking to work towards not using this. I'm looking towards getting back to resistance training or using RPE. Now, this is something that I would encourage you to use if you are not tolerating running, if you have certain amount of housework that you want to be able to do, or a requirement in your job that you need to be able to tolerate. Use this reasoning system. Self-management is an incredibly useful tool to help you identify what you are and aren't tolerating. So jotting down and developing note-keeping skills, I've got another video on that elsewhere. Have a go at trying to use this to guide you to get your symptoms back under control. Good luck.